Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Begin now a new series, not tremendously long, about historical figures, Jewish historical figures, that are, some of them knew each other, most of them did not, but basically they were people that are, whose lives are somehow intersected. That would be perhaps the best word to say intersected by the expulsion from Spain. Just to mention just a date, it is 1492. It's almost exactly the same date of the discovery of America. Was also the expulsion from Spain. The same date, not only in the same year, but perhaps one day removed. See, and there were all kinds of people that made their own sermons about it, about losing a country and winning a country. They were not adjacent to each other, but still there is some kind of a connection. And there are perhaps more connections, but that's not my subject. Now, the expulsion from Spain was one of the most remarkable events in not only medieval, but possibly in the Jewish history. It's in many ways it was a big tragedy that in certain ways, for example, in the Sephardi Kinot for Tisha B'Av, because among other things, the edict of the expulsion was more or less based in the month of Av of that year. But the expulsion of Spain is mentioned in the Kinot as one of those big Jewish tragedies. And indeed, in many ways, to understand it properly. Look, Jews lived in Spain for at least what we call more or less can give historical evidence, at least 1,000 years. There are all kinds of evidence, secondary evidence, and some kind of services, and some hints of it that Jews were in Spain even earlier. If the identification of the word Sfarad in the prophets is identical with Spain as it was accepted for years, then it means that Jews were somehow connected with Sfarad in, so to say, perhaps not for 1,000 years, but for 2,000 years about. And there is, again, we don't really know anything about it, but there is a good idea that is to suggest that with the first Phoenicians that came from the East Mediterranean to the end of the Mediterranean from this coast of the Mediterranean to the other coast, that Jews were also among them. We know the Jews were collaborating with the Phoenician sailors and businessmen for a very long time. So there is a good chance to believe that some Jews were there, even say perhaps in the years before the destruction of the first temple, which means it's quite a long time. And again, it was one of the you see, there are always all kinds of ideas that used to say that Spain, the word Spain comes from, is really should be called Spania, because of the hyraxes, Shfanim, that were seen on the coasts of Spain. I'm not sure that is a good etymology, even though they are not those that we have are not better by any means. Anyway, Jews lived there for a long time. There were times of at the years that we know at the beginning when it was under Christian rule. At least in the later times of the Visigoth rule of Spain, Jews didn't live happily, but with the Muslim conquest of Spain, there was a expansion and the growth of the Jewish population, and Jews remained practically in Spain as long as there were any Muslims there, which is again the same here. Now at this time, Judaism in Spain was not only prolific, say, by having what I call a bigger number of people, but also it is one of the not only what's called the golden age of Spain, our golden age of Spain, but in Spain there was many of the most important achievements of the Jewish spirit were made in Spain in different fields, from Torah study to philosophy to poetry to science. So Spain was a place in which it was a real flourishing of the Jewish spirit. And we are very proud of that period of history. Then it was cut by the edict of they call them the Catholic kings, when the king and queen of Castilla and Aragonia were married to each other, and then they decided, after they removed the last independent Muslim kingdom in Spain, that they will make it a nice Catholic clean land. And so there was an edict that everybody that doesn't accept the Christian religion is to leave the country. Usually, as it was in many other times, he was expected to leave his property behind him, not just real estate, but also money. So most of the people went out of Spain as much as they couldn't smuggle something with them. They became very poor. But still, it was a Jewry that was remarkable by many things. It was, if I could compare it, it wasn't just a flooring in the Jewish sense, but these people had, many of them were connected deeply with what they called with the general culture and with the general way of life. They were in so many ways, they were basically, some of them were the flower of Spain as a country. And when they were after the expulsion, we don't really know. We don't have any real numbers about the time, but there were hundreds of thousands of people were left Spain, and that's one of the things. They basically, in whatever place they went in mass, which is all North Africa, from Morocco and Tunis and Libya and to Egypt. They came there, and usually because they were superior, both in learning, in knowledge, in what I call in actual, say, in actual development, they basically, when most places where they came, they became the spiritual rulers of the place. And so it is basic when we speak about the Eastern Jews, Sephardim. It is not true objectively or historically, but the Sephardi Jewry took over most of the Eastern Jewry, so they are ruling it in one way or another. But that all that would be it is a different story in itself. You may say that Jews are not only in Africa, North Africa, but also in Israel, in Syria, in Turkey, every part of Turkey, and then on one hand to Greece, Bulgaria, and other countries, also partially Hungary, in different times, were all of them Jews from Spain. There were some Jews of Spain that settled and created a very important center in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, and there were Spanish Jews that went as far as Russia. There are still some Russian Jews, very old families, that still carry Spanish names. See, there's a family that had some note, a family called Donichia, that is the family of rabbis in Lithuania. They are here, but there were Jews with this name, and many others. Hamburg was partially, half of it was a settlement of Spanish Jews. One of them who was in modern times, he was the first military ruler of Israel in Jerusalem. He used to say, "Look at me, I'm one of the exceptions. I'm both a Yeke and a Frank," which he was actually. But that was one part, the huge move of people, and whatever they did, directly and indirectly, after the expulsion, they went into other places all over the non-Jewish world. One has to remember also that it was an expulsion. People really were not prepared. Many of them were not prepared at all. It wasn't not, of course, Jewish life wasn't always, was what I call lightness and sweetness in Spain. But still, people thought, we'll survive. And then the expulsion was kind of a cut. So, many people, and again, we don't know any clear numbers. Many people, we don't know if they were the majority or a half, remained in Spain. I would say, theoretically converting to Christianity. Most of them did not belong really in Christianity, didn't believe in it, and that the whole historical creation of the what's called the Marranos, the hidden Jews that lived in Spain and in Portugal for many years. We know that even 100 years and more than 100 years after the expulsion, there were still trickles of people that managed to flee from Spain or from Portugal and to join the Jewish communities elsewhere, and many more others. There was quite in rather recent times, the people discovered that there was a Jewish Marrano settlement in Portugal that survived. The Judaism was, whatever people could do in hiding. But there were Jews that were living 400 years hidden. And at some time they didn't even know that there were any other Jews except them. But they were living and surviving and keeping as much as they could the main Jewish holidays, Yom Kippur, Pesach. I have pictures of that, how they used to make matzahs. See, in Portugal, in Catholic Portugal, which means, now these people, many of them became, of course, they became a part of Spain. There are all kinds of statistics, none of it provable, but they estimate now that about a third of the population of Spain is from a Jewish origin. In Portugal, perhaps the number is even bigger. See, the percentage is bigger. So these Jews were also, it was in many ways an emotional and philosophical problem for the people that indeed left Spain. Why did it happen? Not to one straggler, one or two stragglers, but to so many thousands or hundreds of thousands of Jews that decided that their money is more important. No, those people were not peddlers. Some of them were some of the big magnates of Spain. Some of them became ministers and more than ministers in the government of Spain and Portugal in later years, and unhappily, even some of the Catholic Church saints were also from Jewish origin. For example, the Santa Teresa of Avila was really a Jewish girl. Not that she possibly knew about it. She didn't identify with it, but I'm just saying it just shows how deep and how far-fetched and how very important it was. It was true about possibly every in so many voyages of the Spanish fleet and the Portuguese fleet. There were always some Jews, hidden Jews there, and that's another part of it, which was, among other things, it raised lots of questions. Why did it happen that our people didn't stand fast? That they yielded to the temptations or to the pressure. But anyway, all that it was a very big event in Jewish history, and it had the ramifications of it in many ways are still, in a certain way, you may say, they exist even today, in one way or another. See, it was about culture, about religion, about theology. Many things changed. It is in a kind of a watershed line that divides parts of history in a real way. So now, those people that I choose as a subject are not similar to each other. Very different. They're very different people. Some are known for one thing, others are known for other things. People with different histories, with different destinies and different lives. But all of them are, in a certain way, this kind of the expulsion from Spain was in one directly or indirectly a very important point in their life. So that is the whole series, and I'm trying to deal not with everybody, of course, but with some remarkable people and some enigmatic people that were living in this period, which is basically in a big way in the 16th century. In a big way, perhaps in the earlier parts of the 16th century or the late 15th century, those people that were some of our heroes of different kinds. I even managed to find one woman to put in the list. That not just because she is a woman, but because she was indeed remarkable on her own right. Anyway, let me just begin with the subject of today. Is in historical sequence is the first of this line because he was Don Yitzhak Abravanel was born in basically 1437, and lived until 1508. It's not such a long life. It was a very full life and very exciting life. But he was one of the people, and one of the at least one of the greatest, because in one way he was not just. He was, how to say it, he was a minister in different governments. He, in many ways, at certain times, he was very important in forming the policies of one country after another. He was a big financier, and he used, he possibly was at the peak of his career, an enormously rich person. He had to leave most of it in Spain, as he had to leave, as he says, very, 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 very unhappily. He had to leave to bury all the books he had that he couldn't carry with him. So they were buried somewhere in Spain. But still, that was one way. The great financier, the person that was the advisor of kings, and possibly the person that led things in many what are called historical and political events. On the other hand, and together, because even though there were times when he was far more busy in state affairs or in Jewish affairs, in other times, and it was, to speak about the person, he was always, in a way, feeling that he's possibly wasting his time doing politics or doing finances, when he could be, and he was, a great Jewish scholar. So he was, from time to time, I am not just saying it because I say of belated secularism, because he writes about it. He writes about it. How many times he was thinking that even his sufferings are a punishment for being too much involved in this world instead of the higher world. But anyway, he still managed to write a fair number of books, of different important books in themselves, even though the impact on and in general was not equal to the great number of books that he wrote. But at least he was. You see, even when people didn't know anything about his historical position, they knew his name as a rabbi, as an author, and vice versa. So that is the person, kind of a person of a, as he had two sides to his nature. Now, possibly most of the people that I'm going to speak about had those different sides to them, but not so in such a remarkable way, in such a way of, some of them were more leaning to one side, others to the other side, but he was, in a certain way, he's equally in both worlds. Now, we know that he came from a family that was already very influential and very rich family. This family of Abravanel was known a few generations before as great men, as people that were involved, say, in not just in, so they were not he was not a shamish or a gabbai in shul. They were people that were dealing with kings and leading what happened in the history, and this was for several generations of the family. Incidentally, and that is, they had always the notion. I don't think it was proven, but they were always claiming that they are descendants of the King David, which could be very well true, but I'm just saying that was a part that you may meet Abravanels even today. There are some here and there that you can find. Again, some of them are important people. Some of them are just people with carrying the name, and all of them are very proud of this of the royal descent. All of them are proud of it. That is some of them don't remember almost anything else from being Jewish, except that they are descendants of the King David. Anyway, it was a powerful family, and a family that was again very much into Jewish life. Because even in those times, there were people that were more or less, in one way or another, far more involved in the general world than in the Jewish world. But this was a family that was a scholarly family, and Don Yitzhak Abravanel got a good education, a good Jewish education from the very beginning. So he... I suppose that except his Hebrew, which is very fluent in his writings, except for his Hebrew, he surely knew and used extensively Latin. Not to speak about Spanish and Portuguese, if they are as little distinguished as they were in those times, and possibly Italian as well. So he was say in both ways important, and he had basically from the very beginning he wanted to create things also in the Jewish world. Some of his books he began at a quite early age, in his 20s perhaps. Many of them he didn't finish until his 60s, but they were books that he began and works that he dreamt about. Possibly not all of them were finished, but he did a great amount of work. It was again getting in and out in those two worlds. Now, after his father, who was again practically the finest minister in his country, Don Yitzhak Abravanel, I don't know if he inherited the position, but he inherited more or less the basic stance of being not just the most important Jew in the country, but also the person who was involved with the finances of the kings, and far beyond that, because even today it's not such a big change in the world. Even today, the people who control the finances of a country have something of a say about the general politics of the country. Even today. Surely in those times where they didn't have this departmentalized world was not as well developed then as now, when the same people were dealing with different things. But he was perhaps considered some kind of a financial wizard of the time, and he gave for the government. He got, for example, we know about huge loans that he gave to the king, and I'm saying huge, even in our time scales, huge loans in which a great part of it were his own money, and usually it was money invested, and so he really became very rich and much more and more affluent. He was involved in all kinds with the politics with King Alphonse in the Aragon. His relationship was basically with Aragon, but he had to play with Castilla and with Aragon. He was accused of joining a revolt in Aragon, which was again these are interesting times from a political point of view, but there were times in which things happened. They were happening. These are the times in which we can say the sinking or the end of the feudal system, and the creation of the modern national states in one way or another, and with that, surely in Spain and in Portugal, they also began something that came from the. They were for many years the Christians, Spaniards from the north, in which they were always there, places that were always Christian, like Navarra and so on, to other places which they conquered with the time. They were conquistados, conquerors, and that was a part of the tradition. And the next conquest, and that is a part in which also Jews were in so many times and so many reasons were involved in the conquest of the seas and the conquest of other countries. See, there was a time when these two countries took over a fair amount of the world. See, they not only discovered America and everything that was in it, but also many places in Africa and India, their colonies. So it was this kind of a feeling of a desire for expansion, for growing into outside what seemingly a part of it. As I'm putting it, so to say, in brackets, so to say. There should be an interesting question about how much the Jews there and the Jewish influence there had any impact on these places, because Spain was in the 16th century and 17th century one of the biggest empires of the world. 200 years later, both Spain and Portugal are just backward countries that just need now a little bit of loans from others that they possibly despised at the time to get somehow an even keel in one way or another. Now, was it connected? I'm not speaking now about what I call historiographical or theological arguments. In so many countries, there is a nice parallel that I am not going to deal with it extensively, but just mentioning there's a nice parallel between the relationship or the closeness of the local rulers with the local Jews. When there was a good connection and a good relationship, it is parallel to the growth of those countries. When this sank somehow, whether it is a kind of a two parallel events or basically one thing, you can see the same thing happening in many other countries. They kicked out or they suppressed the Jews, and somehow they sank. It's the same thing, say, for places. If you want two examples, say, take Poland. That was for a certain time, again, a big empire. And it became, you see, nice poor Polacks. And take Turkey. It was once again a big empire in its own right. And there is a parallel. Now, whether there was such a parallel within Spain, it is something that cannot be proven, and that's something else. But anyway, Spain was going out and feeling very, very assured. Now, possibly Don Yitzhak Abarbanel was involved in a certain way of making this shidduch between Castilla and Aragon, the two bigger countries within Spain that were fighting, the Muslims and fighting each other, rivaling each other, and because they had the chance that one of them had a son that was the heir, the other had a girl that was the heiress. So they had Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of these countries, were married. That was a beginning of a certain unification of Spain, of the growth of Spain in many ways. There is some evidence that Don Yitzhak Abravanel, who wasn't dealing with politics, and marriages were always, even in our times, only small-scale politics. But in those times, when you speak about countries, it was surely big politics. So to unite those two kingdoms and to make them into something of a unity, that's just. I heard yesterday about they have some kind of a site in which they have sculptures of Ferdinand and Isabella, and saying Ferdinand is like Isabella is like Ferdinand, because both of them were kings. She was the consort of a king. She was a queen on her own right and in her own country, and so there were the notion that both of them are equal, and both of them were possibly very Catholic, and perhaps at the time narrow-minded. And one of the very first, when they came, the power came more or less as unified in about 1480. But then, when they conquered together the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, they felt then that it's the time to clear the country of all foreign influences, and to create a clean Catholic land. Incidentally, the Spaniards were the first, not the first, but they were the most dominant, rulers or for the existence of the Inquisition, which, again, because there are so many poor Jewish boys in Israel who don't know anything, and sometimes they think that the Inquisition had basically very little. Officially, it was nothing to do with Jews. The Inquisition was made mostly against the Marranos, against those that were converted to Christianity, and that the Inquisition was to clean up this part. They didn't even have any right over Jews as long as they were Jews. But that is something else. I'm saying there was a spirit there, a spirit of fanaticism, a spirit of and that was the expulsion from Spain. Now, Don Yitzhak Abravanel, and we know that, and even to the last, he and the other big Jewish magnates of the realm of Spain, of what was then already Spain, it's a country, they tried to offer the kings of Spain any amount of money, and to avoid this edict of expulsion. But basically it didn't work. So now, Don Yitzhak Abravanel, who moved from one country to another, and I say, he was, in many ways, he wasn't a military man, but he was surely very much of a political person, and it was to deal with the finance of the country, of a big united country, to unite all the mechanisms and all the systems of those countries. That was his big work. But it went up to a certain level, which was he was allowed to leave the country. Generally speaking, in some kind of honor, but he was out. He was out. Now, he was also, just to finish, so to say, his life history. He went to Italy, and he went, in fact, to Napoli, in which there was some kind, again, it was a more or less under Spanish influence. There were again princes there, and again, when he came there, almost immediately they appointed him as the chief minister of finance in India, and he stayed there until their country was conquered by the French and so on, destroyed. So he moved with them, and later on moved into other places. The family Abravanel, incidentally, was not only, he was the most important person in the family in his lifetime, and perhaps viewed in a general way. But his children were also involved in political, financial, and scientific. At least many of them were famous doctors. Some of them were financiers, and they brought him at the end to Venice. So, and then he died, which long. And again, we know that even in those times, even though he didn't have any official position, he was again asked to somehow create some kind of political negotiations between Venice. It was then a big power, Venice and Portugal. So he was used almost to his last day as a, what I call, the big man of politics. Even in places in which, in which the Jews were not given too much right, but again, he was outstanding, and everybody knew about his statue. But in those times, especially in the times of suffering, times of exile, it was, I thought, he wasn't exiled in poverty, basically, and in most of the time, until there were all kinds of very unpleasant occasions, which when other armies came into the same country. But basically, he wasn't an impoverished person, and he had the time and the ability to write quite a number of books. And I'm now going just to speak about something about the books. Now, he wrote several kinds of books. He wrote commentaries about most of the Bible. Say, if one should say something, it's perhaps, posthumously so very nice. He was a rich man. I'm not saying it just to make a point about it. And he used to spend money, and he also wrote like this. If he could make his writings, say it, about 2/3, to cut 2/3 of it, it would be far more influential, because it is sometimes to read him. He's not writing. He's very clear and very able to express himself. But okay, how long can you carry one idea for 1 page, 2 pages, 3 pages, and so on? Some people get tired from it, even people that are accustomed to study. But that is what he is doing now. His commentaries to the Bible, for example, have a basic system. He begins a chapter or a section there, and begins usually with a number of questions about 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 the story. And these questions are different levels of questions, but most of them go to the contents. In that sense, he was not very much interested in grammar, even in philology per se. He was interested in ideas and in events. When he wrote about the what are called the books of the first books of the prophets, which means the books of the historical books of the Bible, he said again in his preface that he thinks that he's especially equipped to write about them, because unlike most of the other commentators, he knew what politics is, because these books that speak about what I call the history of the people of Israel in the first temple time, they are books that have to deal with the involvement and development of historical events, of political events, of interaction between the different powers. And he thought, it's rightly, that he understands these matters better than most other commentators, because he knew what he was writing about. So these books are going like this, and I'm saying he takes his time. He takes his time. If I may add something else, some of his questions are far more successful than his answers. See, no, I'm saying, incidentally, it's not nothing like of a fault. Some people have the sense and the ability to see problems and to ask the right questions. Now, to ask the right questions is, as they used to say, a nice statement in Hebrew, that she'elat chacham chatzi tshuva, the question of a wise man is half of an answer, and it would be true about science almost in every field. To formulate the right question is as important as finding an answer. When you get the right formulation for a question, you have already the basis for an answer for this question. So in that sense, he asked many questions, some of them very basic questions, and he's also dealing in many ways with some of those things that many of the earlier commentators, and greater in creativity, greater in ability, like Rashi and others, didn't dare to ask these questions. These are questions about sequence of events, questions about morality, questions about how people do behave and how they should be judged, and so on. So his questions are many times good questions, and so he does in many other books of his, in which he asks very good questions and he gives answers. And I say, no, his writing is, to give it some kind of a figure, even though he was in many ways, he was a scholar in the Jewish sense, a scholar which means that knew the Jewish sources. And I'm not speaking now as a professor at the university now, which is, okay, can be examined on half of a book and give the answers that he was taught. But I'm speaking about, he was a scholar. He knew his Talmud, he knew the other books that people have to know. He knew them. But his basic writing is not so much Talmudic. It is also, interestingly, not very much, even though there was already the beginning, but there's very little about Kabbalah in his writings. And a great amount of philosophy, in which he was involved and he understood philosophy. He wrote, among other things, a commentary on the Rambam, on Moreh Nevuchim, in which he makes. And now he was a strong man. He wasn't afraid practically, or anybody, say, not his contemporaries, perhaps not in the past. He once writes about, in some point, he says, now I explained up to now what Rabbeinu Moshe has to say, meaning the Rambam. It doesn't mean that is the same thing that Moshe Rabbeinu thought to be right. So it's kind of, so in many ways he writes a commentary on the Rambam, and some people said it's possibly one of the deepest and best commentaries on the Rambam, but he doesn't write about it as a person that has to always to defend and to speak for the author, but he's in many ways, in his commentary, in several other books, is quite critical of the Rambam. He doesn't accept his opinion in a fair number of important points, as he didn't accept the opinions of many other people in the same time. But he is, in that sense, he had his own stance, his own way of dealing with things. He, as I say, he wrote books of commentary on the Rambam, on most of the Bible, on the Agadah of Pesach, on Pirkei Avot, big volumes all, see, on Pirkei Avot, and each of them is interesting. All of them are full with his very, very good knowledge of other sources, because it's clear that he used Latin fluently. So and there is sometimes in an open way, sometimes hidden way. There is his what I call his relationship, his intellectual relationship, also with the late fathers of the church. Say, in writing, in comparing notes, he was philosophically speaking. He was not, he was not like the Maimonides. He wasn't a full Aristotelian. He was, in a certain way, he tried to make what some other people before him tried to do, and it's even true about Maimonides. There is some kind of a meetings and relations between Platonic and Aristotelian thinking in his writings. Just to make some remark, there was the son of Don Isaac Abravanel, who lived in Italy, wrote a book which is basically Neoplatonic philosophy, which is called Dialogi d'Amore, dialogues about love. And this book was, in its time, it was possibly one of the best sellers of the time. They said that within the first 5 years since the book appeared, it was published. Remember, we are speaking about the beginning of the 16th century. It was published dozens of times. And it was translated already in 4 languages, except Italian. And it's still, at this time, it had a big influence. But that is basically, unlike his father, very much Neoplatonic philosophy. Very much so. But the father was, he tried in a certain way to combine the ideas of Aristotelian philosophy, which he didn't accept completely. See, in that sense, he was an independent thinker. He didn't accept it completely. On the other hand, he has Platonian and Neoplatonian ideas mixed up, and some other influences in his writing. So they appear in almost all his books, which are, all in all, he is, let me just say, he is possibly full of philosophical knowledge. In many ways, he doesn't feel that he is dependent on that philosophical knowledge. He was in many ways it was far more important for him his what I call his Jewish ideas, and in this he sometimes tried to do all kinds of new things. There were at least 3 books that he wrote about what he thought was, as many people thought at the time, that it was a time, an apocalyptic time, in which it seems like the times that Mashiach is coming. The expulsion from Spain was for him one of the signs, but all the movement of the world, and people don't always remember it, but it's about the same time it was the final, not a decline, but the final fall of the Roman Empire, of Byzance. So it became what we call a Turkish possession, and so there was a biggest expansion and growth of the Muslims, and he was thinking about that there is the time coming for perhaps the big war in the world of the two contending powers, that at the end of them will be like in some of the prophetic books will come the times of the Mashiach. And his view of the Mashiach is, interestingly, I'm not going into details because some of it was quoted, and Abarbanel is usually quoted when you want to find something bizarre ideas, so you can find them there. So because his opinions about the Mashiach are basically not like that of the Rambam. The Rambam pictures the Mashiach as a great ruler that will come, and it doesn't demand from him almost anything supernatural. Now, in the views of Abarbanel, Mashiach is partially a supernatural being, and he speaks about it in this way. Now, in so many ways, the books were at least timely books, because at the time it was, when you think about it, historically speaking, kind of a big depression for the Jews. His writings about the coming of Mashiach, and all the details that he writes, and his extensive use of the Jewish sources and different ways of the what I call, whether it is halakha, mostly Agada, about 3 books that he's writing about that, which is very important in the time, and as I say, they are still quoted in nowadays in different ways. So this was his bulk of writings was basically centered around basic Jewish sources, as a commentator and as a thinker. He trying to promote some ideas, and if one thinks about that, see, he surely understood politics, and he understood what, as I say, even I don't know how many people of the time, generally speaking, understood it as well as he did. See, he was living in different countries, in different realms, and he was involved not just in small-time things, but in creating what I call the big issues. So he understood it. So when he writes about these issues, it's clearly outstanding in many ways. So, as I say, this is the man who was a man that was outstanding person in every point, every side he wanted. He dealt with. What he tried to do in Spain was, Jewishly speaking, wasn't very helpful for us. Possibly for the Spanish history, possibly the Spaniards should honor him much more than they did in their time. because of his involvement and what he gave to this country and building of the country, and so in so many other places. In the Jewish area, he opened up different points of view, and he also he began not only his questions, his open questions, but also his hidden questions, were not all of them developed at the time, but many of them came to bear fruit 100, 200, 300 years after him. So when the same kind of questions are arising again, and sometimes when you want to find somebody that deals with basic questions, both about faith, which he has say in one way he's very novel and very unusual, and as I say, he didn't care much, or at least he wasn't dependent basically to anybody. So it is important, it is new, it is mostly beginnings of things. He didn't create something that you may call in most places a permanent big structure. Not about even though he dealt with all kinds of things from the basic points of the credo to what people have to do. But basically he didn't write much or very little about halacha. But he wrote about something about contemporary life and understanding ancient times. So in that sense, he's a different picture that is, in some ways, not. It will be difficult to say because to define it as such. He was in one way a form, a model of something that grew up in Spain. This kind of in Spain, in Jewish Spain, not as epigons or as people or second-rate people, but a person that is in a certain way embodies within himself most of what we call it, the thinking of both of the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world, embodying it, then putting them together, trying to create new things out of them, and in a way creating things that only many years ago there were anybody that tried to deal with such the big issues. And I say he's not afraid of dealing with any big issue and fighting with anybody in the past. And sometimes very clear language, not offensive, but very clear. I don't want to quote some of the things that he said about Ashkenazi Jews. He didn't admire them over much, but he is again following a nice old Sephardi tradition. They didn't admire the Ashkenazi Jews. But anyway, he created a world. He created a world that is worthwhile in itself. And that is one of those outstanding personalities. They are not as some people are at the crossroads of historical development. In that sense, he was one of the people that were in the time. The world, even the Jewish world, developed not in the way that he thought about it. In fact, the same time, the same cut of the expulsion from Spain is also the beginning of what I would call it the modern Jewish theology, which is mostly Kabbalistic. And he was not a part of it. He wasn't a part of it, but he opened the way for that. He opened the way for that by disregarding the old material and creating a new building. So that is the person. And Mirz Hashem, next week we'll deal with some other people that are at least the distinction of being very different from that person.